Hey everybody, welcome back. Miss Calabrese here. So in this video, we're going to be talking about bacterial infections of the skin and of the eye. All right, so before we get into the actual bacterial infections, we should talk about what the normal microbiome looks like. So remember that you have bacteria, uh, viruses, you've got fungi, you've got protozoans, you might even have some arthropods that are living on you all the time, right, as part of your normal microbiome. And a large number of those normal flora are actually protective, right? So they help to keep you from getting infections from pathogenic species. And these are going to be, again, a lot of them are going to be bacteria, but we are also going to have some fungus there. So major skin flora are going to be the diphtheroids, some staphylococci, some yeasts are definitely going to be present. And the type of microbiome or the type of community that we find in particular areas usually has to do with the environment of that area, right? So for example, if we look at this kind of drawing of a human body and all the different regions, you can imagine that different regions of your body are going to have different oil content, different sweat content, and so those different kind of environments, our environmental conditions are going to promote the growth of certain types of bacteria. So, for example, in dry skin areas, areas that are much drier, we find beta proteobacteria. In oilier areas, then we find more of these propionibacteria. So it depends on where we are in the body, what type of bacteria we're going to be finding in those areas. Okay, so now getting into the skin infections a little bit. So remember, your skin is one of your first lines of defense, and it acts as a first line of defense because it's a really thick, kind of multi-layered, waterproof, protective covering over your body. But there are still some points of entry, right? So if you have damage to the skin, so if you have a cut somewhere, then that skin is compromised, and it might act as a point of entry for a particular infection. Even things like hair follicles can act as points of entry, so they can enter in through the skin in that way. Right. So these are just some visual examples of different types of skin lesions that are possible on the skin. So and these are just kind of refer to the characteristics of these lesions. So a crust is something that's very superficial. You're going to see kind of on the surface of the skin. It might look a little, well, literally crusty in appearance. A cyst is going to be a little bit deeper, and it's going to be kind of a pocket of material that's underneath the surface of the skin. Macules and papules are pretty superficial. Vesicles and wheals are similar in structure, but these are kind of almost like swellings that are just underneath the surface of the skin. A pustule is one that's going to be filled with pus underneath the surface. All right, so hair follicle infections are very, very common. So again, a hair follicle is a good way to gain entry into the skin for pathogens. Most hair follicle infections are caused by Staphylococcus aureus, and these infections can range from being really, really mild to something that can be significant. And we can see a lot of different results from infection from Staph aureus. So Staph aureus can cause simple things like folliculitis, which are these hair follicle infections, to impetigo, which would be more of a crust on the surface of the skin, to something like scalded skin syndrome, which is where the skin actually starts to peel. So lots of different diseases can possibly be caused by the same Staph aureus. All right, so as far as pathogenesis here for a hair follicle infection, the staph is basically going to attach to the cells in the hair follicle, and that's going to trigger an inflammatory response. So we talked maybe last week about what an inflammatory response looks like. So when these cells feel like they're being damaged, or they sense the presence of a pathogen, they can release chemical signals that are going to attract um, uh, some leukocytes that are going to initiate your inflammatory response, so the redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And so when particularly neutrophils are coming to the site of damage. They're going to start phagocytizing the staph, and as they phagocytize the bacteria, they die. And that's going to result in this kind of buildup of dead leukocytes, which is essentially pus. Which, what pus is this buildup of dead leukocytes. So we get this plug of cells and dead tissue, and that's what starts to look like this kind of pustule under or near the surface of the skin. All right, so there's a typical process of a hair follicle infection. So in this first picture up here, we can see that we've got the staph kind of on the surface of the skin. What they're going to do there is then follow down that hair shaft into the follicle, and as they go down into the follicle, that's going to trigger the cells that are near this tissue to send out their warning signals that the skin has been compromised. That's going to initiate the inflammatory response, and as we draw all those um, phagocytes to the area, they're going to start to consume um, the bacteria, and then as they consume, many of them will die, and that's what's going to result in this plug of necrotic material here. Okay. So epidemiology for these type of hair follicle infections, um, this is really, really common. And in fact, Staph aureus itself lives in the nose. It's primarily where we find Staph aureus. And it's normal for most people. So many normal healthy people carry Staph aureus in their nose as just part of their normal microbiome. And sometimes it's there all the time, sometimes it's there transiently, but it tends to be part of this normal microbiome. And so usually because it's in the nose, transmission is going to be on the hands. So blow your nose or sneeze or whatever without washing your hands afterwards, and you can transmit that Staph aureus from the nose to the skin, and that's what can result in these type of infections. Um, as far as prevention, very difficult just because of the prevalence of Staph aureus, because it's part of the normal microbiome. For many people, it's just going to be all over the place. But hand washing, and then if infection does happen, use of a topical antibiotic is usually sufficient. Okay, so moving on to infections of the eye here. So conjunctivitis is an infection of the conjunctiva, which is a membrane that sort of covers the anterior surface of the eyeball and also the inside surfaces of the eyelids. That's your conjunctiva. So an inflammation of these membranes can be caused by bacterial infection, could be viral. There's even such a thing as allergic conjunctivitis that's not caused by a pathogen at all. It's just it's an allergic response. Right. So as far as knowing the differences between these different types of conjunctivitis, the common ones are going to be bacterial and viral. Acute purulent conjunctivitis, so purulent means with pus. So acute purulent conjunctivitis is usually caused by a bacterial infection. Acute hemorrhagic, with these hemorrhages, so the presence of blood, that's usually viral. All right, moving on to another skin infection here. So Staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome, or SSSS. So this is a superficial infection of the skin caused by Staph aureus. It's much, much more common in babies and children, and it basically just causes shedding of the top epidermal layers of skin. So we get this redness and kind of peeling skin because of the superficial staph infection. Another common skin infection is impetigo. Impetigo can be caused by staph. It can also be caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. And so this is a pyoderma infection, which means that we get pus production here too. And so you can see in this image, we've got this kind of crusted over wound on the surface of the skin. And this can happen from a lot of different things. So basically, you just need to create a point of entry. So scratch on the surface of the skin, a little scrape, an insect bite, anything that's going to create an opening could lead to impetigo. And very common, especially in children. As long as that bacteria is able to gain entry, it will then start an infection. and it causes its damage with enzymes. So the virulence factors here are things like proteases, and proteases are enzymes that degrade skin proteins. Hyaluronidase degrades the one of the proteins in your connective tissues. And that kind of destruction is what's going to cause these sores to form. All right. So as far as prevention and treatment, it's wash your hands and make sure you clean out any skin wounds before bacteria have time to go in and create an infection. Very common among children, just because they tend to bump and bruise themselves pretty easily, and they also don't tend to wash quite as well as adults. All right, so moving on to Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is a bacterial infection. I put it here in the skin unit because it starts as a skin infection. So Lyme disease is caused by this bacterium, Borrelia burgdorferi. So he's this spiral-shaped bacterium down here. And he gains entry to the body through the bite of an infected tick. So the tick is infected with this Borrelia, and then when the tick bites the human, then we usually get this characteristic bullseye-shaped rash on the surface of the skin where the tick has bitten, and that's the expansion of the bacteria into the skin. All right. So first stages of Lyme disease is erythema migrans, so a skin rash that's kind of expanding, and then possibly enlargement of the lymph nodes as your body begins to react to the presence of this bacteria. But then usually that skin rash looks kind of like a target or a bullseye in appearance. Initial infection could result in some flu-like symptoms, so just general malaise, fever, headache, and stiffness. After that first phase, then we move into the second phase of Lyme disease, which is where the bacteria is going to not stay, it's not lingering in the skin. It's actually going to go and involve your heart, possibly your nervous system. Eventually, it will even get into your joints. So the third stage of Lyme disease is when it starts to get into the joints and start to cause arthritis. Um, and again, this could take a very long time for it to progress to this point, um, up to 6 months or even years before it gets into that third stage. All right, so yeah, as far as pathogenesis go, the bacteria are entering the skin through the bite of the infected tick. These ticks can be extremely small. So here's an image of what these ticks look like next to a penny. So really, really tiny tick bite that can carry this very painful disease. Um, and so once the bacteria enter the body, they're going to get into the bloodstream, and that's how they're going to circulate all throughout the body and find their way into the heart, nervous system, and joints. All right, so because this is spread by a tick, which is an animal, we consider this a zoonotic disease. At this point, it's pretty widespread in the United States. It used to be pretty localized to the regions of the Northeast, but now we're pretty much seeing it anywhere, everywhere as this particular tick, the black-legged tick, um, um, expands across the U.S. We're seeing a lot of this, a lot more of this disease. As far as treatment goes, it can be treated with antibiotics in early stages. So if you catch it early, it's treatable. But if you catch it later, it's much more difficult to treat. All right, so quick question here. What type of bacteria are we most likely to find in drier areas of the skin? So what do you think in dry areas, what are we going to find? All right, and there's your answer. So in dry areas of the skin, we're likely to find the beta proteobacteria. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.